What if one of history's greatest leaders was also its worst? Frederick the Great might be the most famous Prussian king, but his legacy is much more complicated than Prussian blue. From waging aggressive wars to having an illegitimate child with his half-sister, he might have been one of the most problematic monarchs in history. So what made Frederick the Great so great? And were there any consequences to his actions? Welcome to my channel. Today we'll be looking at the dark side of Frederick the Great. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subject. Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia from 1740 to 1786, is a legendary figure in history books. He led Prussia to victory over the combined forces of Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, and Denmark in the 7 Years' War. But that's not all he's known for. Frederick was a man ahead of his time. As an enlightened despot, he abolished serfdom in his kingdom and introduced many social reforms. He was a prolific writer and a patron of the arts, and as a young man, he was quite the heartthrob. Frederick the Great may have been the OG progressive king, but he had his own share of skeletons in his closet. Let's find out more about them. Aggressive expansionism. When Frederick came to power in 1740, Prussia was just a small state surrounded by more powerful neighbors. Frederick set about changing that through a series of aggressive maneuvers. The first target was Silesia, a province of Austria ruled by Maria Theresa. Frederick claimed the province as his own and marched his troops into it without declaring war. Maria Theresa, outraged, appealed to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VII for help. This kicked off the War of the Austrian Succession. With the death of the previous emperor, Charles's mother, Elizabeth, there was no clear heir to the Habsburg dynasty, and several German princes wanted the crown. Charles eventually won the war and secured his position as Holy Roman Emperor, but he couldn't save some. Frederick held on to his prize, Silesian lands. He used the wealth of the region to build up the Prussian army, which would become one of the most formidable forces in Europe. Frederick went on to conquer more territory in the north and east, turning Prussia into a major power. These military victories made him extremely popular at home. According to one story, when Frederick returned to Berlin after winning the Battle of Leuthen, common folk rushed into the streets to get a glimpse of their beloved king. Unfortunately, Frederick did not share the same enthusiasm for the people. He looked down on the commoners and spent very little time in Berlin. Instead, he preferred to stay in his country estate, where he enjoyed hunting and playing the flute. Exploitation of serfs. Frederick the Great's attitude towards the peasants in his domain was far from ideal. In fact, he was downright exploitative. Like most European monarchs of the time, Frederick owned all the land in Prussia, and the peasants who lived on it were legally bound to the land as serfs. They couldn't leave their homes without permission, and they had to work long hours for low pay. Frederick was particularly harsh on the peasants in Silesia, who he considered lazy and unproductive. After conquering the region, he imposed heavy taxes on them to pay for his wars, and refused to allow them to leave Silesia to escape his rule. But he wasn't totally heartless. In 1755, Frederick issued a decree that allowed the peasants to leave Silesia if they could prove that they were skilled workers. This created a system of state-sponsored labor migration that lasted until the end of World War I. Frederick also passed laws that made it easier for peasants to own property and get married. But these reforms didn't do much to improve the lives of the average peasant. Frederick the Great might have been an enlightened despot, but he was still a tyrant. Oppression of religious minorities. Frederick the Great was not a fan of people who didn't share his religious beliefs. As a Lutheran, he saw other Christians as inferior, especially the Jews. Frederick's anti-Semitism was evident in the laws he passed during his reign. He barred Jews from owning property or working in certain professions, and forced them to wear a special badge around their necks, so they could be easily identified. He also expelled large numbers of Jews from Prussia, many of whom settled in Eastern Germany and Poland. But Frederick's religious intolerance didn't stop there. He was also hostile towards Catholics, and even his own cousin, King George II of England. Frederick broke off diplomatic relations with Britain in 1756. George refused to convert to Lutheranism. Frederick's anti-English feelings ran so deep that he even started his own war with Britain in 1779. Luckily for Frederick, the war didn't go too badly. He managed to hold off the British and secure his position as the dominant power in northern Germany. But the war did come at a cost. Frederick's army was badly damaged, and his treasury was nearly empty by the end of the conflict. To make matters worse, Frederick's health was also deteriorating. He suffered from a number of ailments, including diabetes and gout, and he was increasingly reliant on alcohol to ease his pain. Despite his many problems, Frederick the Great continued to rule Prussia with an iron fist until his death in 1786. During his reign, he transformed Prussia from a minor state into a major power and laid the foundations for the German Empire. However, his legacy is a complicated one. On the one hand, he was a brilliant military leader and a shrewd politician. On the other hand, he was a cruel and oppressive ruler who showed little regard for the rights or welfare of his subjects. Frederick's story is a reminder that even the greatest leaders are human beings with both strengths and weaknesses. Scandalous personal life. Frederick the Great might have been a champion of tolerance, but he himself was anything but. The king's personal life was a scandal, to say the least. His relationship with his father, Frederick William My Eyes, was particularly. Frederick's mother died when he was only 5 years old and his father took over as regent. The two became close until Frederick began expressing interest in things like philosophy and art, which his father saw as frivolous. Frederick William was determined to turn his son into a soldier, but Frederick's heart just wasn't in it. He faked a health problem to get out of military training and eventually became a conspirator. At age 19, Frederick escaped from his father's clutches and fled to England. There, he met King George II, who gave him asylum. Frederick stayed in Britain for 3 years, learning about the culture and customs of the English. He also fell in love with an English woman named Hannah Defoe, who became the inspiration for his future mistress. When Frederick finally returned to Prussia, his relationship with his father had improved, but his scandalous personal life would continue. In 1751, Frederick had a son with his half-sister Will. The two were first cousins once removed, and the child was born after Frederick's marriage to his cousin, Princess Elizabeth's affair of Brunswick. Frederick kept the affair and the pregnancy a secret for several years, but eventually the truth came out. The scandal nearly cost Frederick his throne, but he managed to save his job thanks to his popularity among the people. Frederick's son, however, was not so lucky. The boy was declared illegitimate and raised outside the royal court. Frederick never saw his son again. Did Frederick's illegitimate child receive any inheritance? The answer is no. The boy was raised outside the royal court and received no financial support from his father. Frederick the Great might have been a progressive thinker in many ways, but he was also a product of his time. He believed in the divine right of kings and saw himself as above the law. He also believed that his personal life was his own business and should not be subject to public scrutiny. However, Frederick's scandals did not just affect him personally. They also had serious consequences for Prussia as a whole. For example, his decision to break with Britain over the issue of religious tolerance led to a costly war that nearly bankrupted the kingdom. Frederick's behavior was often baffling and contradictory. For example, he was a teetotaler who hosted huge drinking parties, and he was an animal rights activist who enjoyed hunting animals. Frederick was also a hypochondriac who took his medicine religiously and consulted doctors constantly. But despite his many Frederick the Great was undoubtedly one of the most significant figures in European history. He was a brilliant military leader who helped to shape the continent's political landscape. He was also a progressive reformer who introduced many new ideas about government and society. Whether we admire him or not, there's no denying that Frederick the Great was a complex and fascinating man. What do you think? Do you think Frederick the Great was a good or bad king? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos about the most infamous figures in history. Thank you for watching.